Assalamualaikum. My name is Siti Mariam binti Abdullah. My metric number is 271655. Today I would like to present about the effect of liquidity risk and market risk on Mr. DIY Group Bwrr performance from 2015 until 2019. So we move to the next slide. Is about the company overview. Mr. DIY was started as a consumer hardware store in Jalan Tuanku Abdul Rahman, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in July 2005. The company then expanded to open store in Ayer Shopping Mall in 2009, Tesco Setia Alam Selangor in 2010, Yaya Shopping Outlet and Borneo Hypermall in 2014. Palm Square Commercial Centre in 2017. In 2017, the company launched its e-commerce platform during the COVID-19 outbreak. Mr. DIY distributed personal protective equipment or PPE and face masks to COVID-19 hospital, governance clinics, police and public in Malaysia. Mr. DIY also was public listed on the Bursa Malaysia in October 2020. The next slide is about the research objective. This case have a three research objective. The first one is to identify the external factor influencing the company performance. The second one is to identify the external factor influencing the company performance, and the third one is to examine the external factor that influencing performance. Okay, we move to the next topic is about the literature where review is have a 5 literature review. The first one is market risk that involve risk of changes in the business center where the corporation find business opportunities. The second one is about the operational risk. Several risks has risen dramatically because of this predicament. Internal and external factor might have an impact and on operational risk. The third one is credit risk. The danger of loss for individual of corporation who advance a credit limit to another party is referred to as a credit risk. The fourth one is profitability. Both profitability and growth momentum are vital to the organization existence and attractiveness to financial specialists and examiner to preserve the business. And the last one is a liquidity risk. Liquidity risk defined as a risk of an entity failing to prepare to the necessary fund to fulfill short-term or moderate-term commitments. So the next slide is about the design and methodology. It's about the process used to conduct the research. F referred to as a research methodology. So the first one is sampling technology. We collected data using the Mr. DIY Group Bwrr annual report. The second one is data analysis. Data analysis is the link or correlation between one dependent variable and the other independent variable is described in this study using the conceptual framework as you can see in this slide for the data analysis. The third one is statistical package for social science SPSF. IBM SPSF version 20 ability to the descriptive statistic, bivariate statistic, numerical result prediction and group prediction. So we move to the next slide is about the finding and analysis. This chapter we present the interpretation of the finding from the SPSS output. So we move the first one is about the external factor that about the model summary as you can see on the slide. So the CG index, debt to income and quick ratio explain 99.3% of the variance independent variable according to the model summary of dependent and external components. So according to the Dubbing Watson, W. Watson, an acceptable value is greater than 1.5 but less than 3. To make a decent profit, we may deduct to the CG index, debt to income and quick ratio are highly related to ROA. The second table is ANOVA. So the CG index, debt to income and quick ratio has a little effect on a return on asset. Because the P value is more than 0.05, this is case, the ROA will affected by the CG index, debt to income and quick ratio according to the past study of Umar Durrah. So the third one is coefficient. The relationship between the dependent variable and the firm specific component, which p-value is 0.05. We discovered that the CG index has greatest significance effect on ROA. The CG index has greatest t-value, which is a p-value is 0.046, which is less than 0.05. This is CG index has been effect to ROA. The next slide is show about the external factor. So the first table is model summary. According to the analysis that you can see, currency rate, interest rate, and stress account for 99.3% of the variance in the dependent variable. According to the W. Watson, the dependent variable is substantially related to the exchange rate, interest rate, and inflation. So we move to the Table 2 about the ANOVA. Because the p-value is greater than 0.05, the table above reveals that ROA is not substantially associated to exchange rate, interest rate, or inflation. This result contradicted Juris Mahdi study, which found that currency rate, interest rate, and inflation has a little impact of liquidity. The third table is coefficient. Because the p-value is greater than 0.05, the study conclude that thought interest rate has a largest t-value. It shows has no significant impact of the dependent variable. That is inflation, interest rate, and currency exchange rate. We have no impact on the ROA. We move to the internal and external factor. So the first one is model summary. According to the study, GDP, debt to income, and interest rate account is negative 0.293 of the various independent variable. The amount is less than 1.5 according to W. Watson. So they demonstrate to the GDP, the income, interest rate are unrelated to ROA. The second table is ANOVA. Because P value is 0.683, which are greater than 0.05, we can deduct the ROA has no substantial impact of interest rate, debt to income ratio, or GDP. This result found that interest rate, debt income ratio, GDP has no bearing on the ROA. The last one is coefficient. According to the coefficient table that you can see, interest rate has a higher t-value of 0.739, but neither internal or external factor have a significant effect on ROA. This is because p-value is greater than 0.05. So that's mean GDP, debt to income ratio, GDP, and interest rate will have no impact on ROA. Next, we move to the company performance. The return on asset or ROA is a metric has been used to assess a company's performance. A year of return or investment indicate that company is more profitable. The table 2 show is a quick ratio, commonly known as the acid test ratio. So the higher the fast ratio, the more liquidity available is that satisfy company short-term obligation. So that means that from 2019, 2015, 2015 until 2019, that show Mr. DIY Group um, repay the short-term debt is steady, ranging from 0.7 cents to 2.23 cents for each dollar debt. This indicates that Mr. DIY Group have ability to deal to the with an expected short-term even is limited. Okay, the third one is average collection period. In this case of account receivable, the average recovery duration is time it takes for a corporation to recover due money. So Mr. DIY Group average collection time fluctuate as shown is in the graph. So you can see a more detail in the graph. Um, it's thought that the company ability to recoup receivable is limited. So we move to the table of debt to income. Debt to income is measure of company's ability to survive in the face of debt. The ability of a company to repay debt is determined by its cost and revenue structure. So the capacity to use liability to generate profit is quite constant with only a 470.63 cent dispersion. So we move to the next slide is about the operational margin. So after removing the removing variable expenses of production like employee salary and raw material expenses, the operating margin show us whether a company will earn a dollar of revenue before paying interest or taxes. So the percentage is relatively steady if standard deviation of operating margin is near to zero. We move to the CG index. So CG index is calculated using the 5 principle. After CG index is declined in 2018, as you can see, to the 0.8462 before dropping in 2019. Mr. DIY Group have mean CG index of 0.8 and a standard deviation of 0.04217. Next is GDP. It means gross domestic product. So GDP is reflect the world economic activity with a region. The variable utilized analysis Malaysia and group percentage of GDP. So the graph show the Malaysia GDP changes over the course 5 years. So next is inflation rate. The rate of change is purchasing of country currency is known as inflation. So you can see from the table is 2015 until 2019 Malaysia inflation are fluctuated. So the next is interest rate. The above graph despite Malaysia interest rate which fell sharply from 1.25% 2015 to 1.25% in 2017. The value of Malaysian ringgit increased somewhat in 2018 but fell sharply in 2019. So the last one is exchange rate. So as you can see the graph above, Mr. DIY exchange rate is despite the graph above value rose from 4.29% in 2015 to 4.49 in 2016 before falling in 2017. Okay, the value then dropped a little in 2018 but the drop even more in 2019 as you can see in the slide. So we move to the last slide is about the discussion and conclusion. So as conclusion, we can conclude from this research that Mr. DIY Group Bwrr performance has been declining from 2015 until 2019. As we can see from the analysis, the primary factors that influence a company performance are return on equity, ROE ratio and corporate governance index, three of which are firm-specific factor. After running the analysis, we can see the external factor are more significant influence to return on asset. Operational margin has a clean positive association with ROA according to correlation table, meaning that operational margin improve, so does company profitability. So as the recommendation for the problem, the recommendation of this study that should be addressed it would be better to have a benchmark with other industry to compare the ratio analysis. As a result, the future researcher should be advised increase the number of observation as well as the internal and external aspect that represent the aspect of risk to the organization as well as include other industry to compare. As a result, the significant result will be sustained by strong evidence of factor influence and explained to the dependent variable. Thank you for lending me your ears.